Your Eminence, Your Graces, Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen. Introducing a speaker is quite a simple task. I could easily tell you that Father Damaskinos Xenophontos is an Athonite hieromonk who's a lecturer in the School of Theology at the University of Eastern Finland. I could also list some of his scholarly publications in eminent journals and fascinating volumes on a variety of topics: St. Andrew of Crete, St. John of Damascus, the theology of performance, hymnography. The list is impressive. But if I did this, I'd be telling you a few things about him that you can quickly discover by Googling Father Damaskinos and finding his university profile. So I thought I'd tell you a few things about him that you can't find on the internet. I first met Father Damaskinos 7 years ago in 2015 when I traveled to Finland, to Joensuu, for a conference of the International Society of Orthodox Church Music. When I met him, he was neither a monk nor a priest. He was Jaakko Olkinuoura. Jaakko had just finished his doctoral dissertation on the feast of the entrance of the Theotokos into the temple, a PhD thesis which he successfully defended. I got to know him well during this conference, which was a conference like no other. There were academic papers on hymnography and Orthodox ecclesiastical music. There were liturgical services at the nearby Orthodox church and seminary. There were performances of Finnish folk songs during dinner. There was one evening where we tried to chant Christos Anesti, Christ is risen, in as many languages as possible. There was another evening where we learned Georgian folk dancing in the town square. And there were many conversations with scholars from around the world late into the night. In all of these, Jaakko Olkinuoura featured prominently. He was an amazing scholar. He was an excellent chanter. He was a wonderful singer of folk songs. He knew several languages. He was an accomplished Baroque dancer and had studied dance at the Finnish National Ballet. And he was the easiest person in the world to talk with. You felt like you had known him for years, even though it was actually only a few days. I saw Jaakko again later that year in 2015 at the Oxford Patristics Conference. While only a few months had passed, I started noticing something that perhaps I'd missed earlier that year in Joensuu in Finland. Jaakko had a monastic calling in his heart, and indeed, with the passage of time on the Holy Mountain, he was tonsured a monk, he became a deacon, then a priest, and he was given the name Damaskinos after St. John of Damascus. There are many other things I could say about Father Damaskinos, and I haven't even mentioned his famous sourdough, but the things I think that matter are simple. He knows many languages, but the most important language, which he speaks fluently, is the language of liturgy. He knows many songs, but the song he knows best is the song of theology. He may have studied dancing in his youth, but the dance he has now mastered is the one our hymns invite us to experience during the feast of Pascha. Dance now and be glad, O Sion. This is Father Damaskinos' second visit to Australia. He was here in 2018 with the blessing of the late Archbishop Stylianos of blessed memory. And now, with the blessing of Archbishop Makarios, it is a pleasure to have him here once again, especially here at St. Andrew's Theological College. Father Damaskinos, I've said too much, and on this evening, everyone is eager to hear from you, not from me. So without further ado, it is my honor to invite you to come up and present your lecture on the feast of the entrance of the Theotokos into the temple.
Your Eminence, Your Graces, Reverend Fathers, dear friends, first of all, I would like to thank His Eminence for the blessing to speak here and for everyone involved in organizing this event, for all their help and kind invitation to come to speak here. And as Andrew said, I'll try to make this work. Not this. So as Andrew said, my topic today is for me a kind of throwback. It's because the Feast of the Entrance, the Theotokos, was the topic of my doctoral dissertation that I defended and published as a book in 2015 under my lay name. And you can reach the book through this QR link or by Googling the title of the book. It's an open access publication at our university's website, so you will find it there. My book concentrated on the hymnography of the feast from what I call an intermedial point of view. In other words, through the collaboration of different liturgical arts in the liturgical space. But this feast is also approaching soon, so may this talk serve as a form of preparation for that celebration. So what do we celebrate during the entrance? According to tradition, when the Virgin Mary was born, her parents, Joachim and Anna, as an act of thanksgiving for the miraculous birth of this child after a lifelong barrenness, decided to dedicate her to God. This almost took place when Mary was 2 years old, but her parents changed their mind and took her to the temple when she turned 3. There, a group of virgins accompanied her into the temple with candles in their hands. She was received by the high priest Zacharias, and she entered the Holy of Holies, where she was fed by an angel. Nowadays, this feast belongs to the so-called cycle of the 12 great feasts, and it is especially loved by monastics for reasons that you will find out during this talk. But before we delve into the rich theology of this feast, we should have a look at its sources and origins. The narrative of the entrance is an ancient one and is first found in a text today known as the apocryphal Proto-Evangelium of James, probably dating from the mid-2nd century. Proto-Evangelium of James is a nice name, even though it is neither Proto-Evangelium nor written by James, and not even really apocryphal. This text has mainly been transmitted in manuscripts as the Life of Mary, and it has recently been argued that its earliest part dates already from the 1st century, making it a text contemporary with the canonical Gospels. It narrates Mary's life from her birth until Christ's birth, and instead of calling it apocryphal, I would prefer the term quasi-canonical. It has influenced Orthodox theology significantly, and it has at times even been read in liturgical contexts. There has been some historical dispute regarding the Proto-Evangelium, especially in conjunction with the events of the entrance. I mentioned that a group of virgins accompanied the young Theotokos into the temple. Some have criticized this fact and said that there was no such group of virgins living in the temple, which makes the historicity of the entrance impossible. However, there are also other sources that argue for the existence of virgins living in the Temple of Jerusalem. In the Jewish Haggadah tradition, it is mentioned that during the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70 AD, the virgins that weaved the temple curtain jumped into fire and were burnt alive. But despite this early literary evidence that we have for the events of the entrance, the liturgical feast of the entrance does not appear until many centuries later. There were some scholars who claimed the feast could have originated in 543, when the Nea Church in Jerusalem was dedicated on November 20th. However, there is no evidence of these celebrations. The feast does not appear in the Palestinian liturgical lectionaries of that time. Some other scholars speculate it must have begun in Constantinople in the 8th century, because we have 2 sermons attributed to Germanos of Constantinople, who was the patriarch of the city in the 8th century. But we know that the question of authorship of these sermons is by no means certain. We do have evidence, however, quite late for the feast at this time. This information is confirmed by Theodore of Balsamon, who states in the 1100s that the feast was first celebrated in Constantinople in 730. Tharasios of Constantinople, the 9th century author, has written 1 sermon on the entrance, but its question of authorship has also not been examined critically, and it is actually the only sermon that exists that is attributed to Tharasios, and thus it is impossible to compare it stylistically with his other sermons. Despite this, some scholars have speculated that Tharasios might have reinstated the feast in the 9th century in Constantinople after it had before fallen into disuse. It does seem reasonable that the feast would have been introduced in the midst of the iconoclast controversy when devotion to the Theotokos was rapidly increasing. We have sermons on the entrance written by George of Nicomedia from the late 9th century. And likewise, we have rubrical evidence of the celebration of the feast in a 9th or 10th century codex of the Skit of St. Andrew of the Holy Mountain. And the earliest evidence of the celebration of the feast in Palestine derives from the 10th century. So after all this, we are left with very little information on the origins of the feast before the 9th and 10th century. But at that time, it becomes an important feast, both in Constantinople and in Palestine. And actually, it was through Palestine that the Latin Church also adopted the feast. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem learned about the feast from the Greek believers there in Jerusalem. And this is how the feast was imported to the West, where it, however, never became an important feast of the Theotokos. But as we saw, the theme of Mary's entrance was not absent before this liturgical celebration either. The Proto-Evangelium of James, after the Proto-Evangelium of James, the theme is brought up mainly in ascetical texts, most importantly in the 4th century by Athanasius of Alexandria, who presents Mary as the ideal of female ascetics in Alexandria. Saint Athanasius describes her ascetical life in the Temple of Jerusalem. However, the culmination of this aspect of Marian devotion is in the Middle Byzantine period, when a genre now called the Lives of the Virgin appears. First, a text by Epiphanius, the abbot of Kallistos Monastery, in the late 8th or early 9th century. And later in the 10th century, the Lives by John Geometris and Simeon Metaphrastis. There is also a Georgian life attributed to Maximus the Confessor, but in reality, it is a paraphrase of the geometric life compiled by Eftinem Tsatmindeli, Euthemius of the Holy Mountain, dating also from the 10th century. Another critical period from our point of view can be seen in the Hesychast controversy, especially in the work of this protagonist, Gregory Palamas. And gradually, with the establishment of the liturgical celebration of the entrance, we have a rich homiletic and hymnographic tradition for the feast. Here you can see a list of the published homilies of the entrance. There's also a number of unpublished sermons that have not been studied very much, but you can see that there is a blossoming of these sermons in the Middle Byzantine period, and then again in the 14th century during the Hesychast controversies. But instead of remaining on a purely historical level, I want to talk today about the rich theological content of the feast. Metropolitan Kallistos Ware of blessed memory called the entrance the Feast of Mary's Silence. And it is a very accurate term. It is only in very few sources that Mary actually speaks in the temple. Most often she is silent. In the liturgical hymns, she is completely silent, and yet she seems to understand the situation, even though she is only an infant, 3 years old. So I will first discuss typologies that are particularly rich in this feast, and then move on to how the patristic tradition treated the entrance from the point of view of mysticism. The events of the entrance are, in a way, a border zone between the Old and New Covenants. Not quite yet the New Covenant, but getting there. The infant Theotokos is a fulfillment of many Old Testament typologies. Typology being a hermeneutical method that connects two phenomena, persons or objects from different eras, something that we nowadays call type and antitype, could be characterized also as allegory in history. In the case of the entrance, the connection between the two is particularly tangible. The main types that are mentioned in hymns and sermons are Mary as a living temple, an ark, the Holy of Holies, or the furniture therein. Usually in typologies, the type and the antitype are from different eras, as I said, but here they are in the same time and same space. The living temple, the Mother of God, enters the material and physical temple. The spiritual Holy of Holies enters the material Holy of Holies that had at that time been robbed of the Ark of the Covenant. So Mary, by entering the Holy of Holies as the living Ark, takes the place that has been emptied for her. The typology of Mary as the temple is of course not unique for this feast, but instead represents a centuries-old tradition. It was first mentioned by Gregory of Nazianzus in the 4th century, and further on developed by Proclus of Constantinople in the 5th. Most temple-related images appear often during the church year in the Theotokia hymns as a part of a standard repertoire of typologies, but in the context of the entrance, they acquire a special emphasis. A canon of the feast begins with this temple typology as if to point out directly the most important theological image of the feast, presenting Mary as the fulfillment of two Old Testament prefigurations, the temple and its gate. I quote, "Rejoice heaven and earth, exalt God proclaiming prophets, for behold, the one whom you beheld of old as a sealed gate enters the gates of the temple, now recognized as God's most pure temple." On the other hand, the hymn of the forefeast employs the rhetorical device of personification, prosopopoeia, by giving an active role to the temple, and thus creates a feeling of an encounter between two persons. This happens in order to emphasize Mary's own consent to receive the incarnate Logos into her womb. The hymnographer creates a parallelism between Mary's deliberate consent to receive God and the way that the temple, as if it were a person, receives the child. I quote again, "Having opened the gates and entrances, the temple receives the gate of God, the King of all, and adorns the inner paths. At her entrance, the temple is illuminated with grace." Moreover, the idea of Mary as the temple of God is expanded to apply to all men. The Mother of God is exposed as a representative of the whole of humanity, whose aim is, according to the idea of St. Paul, to become temples of the Holy Spirit. I quote again, "Come and behold the strange sight today. The God-containing temple now sets foot in the temple of God, showing her Son that those who sing praises unto her are themselves the dwelling places of God." In addition to the temple, Mary is also called the tabernacle, skini, in order to provide even more epithets to praise her God-containing role. However, a more abstract interpretation for this image is also provided, one referring to the Exodus. Just as Moses raised the tabernacle, which was a tent, on God's order in the desert, thus did Mary raise the whole human race by accepting to carry Christ. As a result of this, the tabernacle, and again the Theotokos herself, symbolize the totality of human nature. I quote, "Stretch out your sacred hands, O venerable elder, and receive the divine tabernacle in the chambers of the temple. Through her, fallen human nature will be raised up like a tent," proclaimed Anna to Zacharias when she dedicated the pure Virgin as an offering. We already noted how the Mother of God is called the sealed gate, an image that reflects the famous vision by Prophet Ezekiel, where the prophet is shown an impassable gate reserved for God himself. This typology most often refers to the virginal motherhood of Mary. The entrance to and from her womb, the temple of the Logos, is only meant for God himself. However, the canons do not remain content with such a simplistic interpretation, but instead this typology acquires more allegorical dimensions and points to a mystery beyond comprehension. The impassibility of the gate is paralleled not only with Mary's physical virginity, but also with the spiritual incomprehensibility of Christ's incarnation. The act of sealing refers to the Dionysian idea of the cloud of darkness surrounding God's essence. On the other hand, the Mother of God is not only a closed gate, but also a gate that opens itself. By opening the gates of the temple with her entrance therein, and accordingly offering her womb to God in order to let him enter the world in human form, Mary has allowed all human reason to rejoice in the spiritual joy of the incarnation. I quote, Having opened the gates of the temple of God, the glorious gate through which human thoughts cannot pass, now urges us to enter with her and to delight in her divine marvels. Even more explicitly, the opening of the gates also alludes to the gate of Eden, which in ancient times was closed because of the transgression of the first Eve. Mary becomes a contrary antitype to the closed gate of the paradise. I quote, "When the impassable gate of the King of Glory is set forth as an offering to him in the hidden part of the temple, the ancient gate of Eden's delight, closed unto humanity by our forefathers, now opens up unto mortals." One of the core actions of the temple was sacrificing, and accordingly, Mary is also considered a sacrifice for all humanity. The relevant passages in the canons connect her with two events, thus creating a twofold typology. As a fulfillment of an event of the old, she is seen as the antitype of the dedication of Samuel in the Old Testament. On the other hand, the event reaches out to events yet to come, and the Mother of God becomes a type for the sacrifice of Christ. The canon of the feast couples these two typologies in a single sentence. Let us all, keeping feast in faith, sing the praises of the undefiled heifer, most glorious and of many names, for she conceived in the flesh the divine calf and sacrificial offering. The heifer actually refers to two Old Testament passages, namely the above-mentioned dedication of Samuel in the temple, where a 3-year-old calf, a male equivalent of heifer, was sacrificed. During her dedication, the Theotokos was also 3 years old, as the Proto-Evangelium of James states, thus making Mary an antitype of both Samuel and the sacrificial calf. But the epithet heifer also connects the Mother of God with the sacrifice of Jesus on behalf of the humanity's sins, by referring to the sin offering described in Leviticus 4 and 5. Also, two other animals are included in the sin offering described by Leviticus, namely ewe lamb and dove, both of which are also used as types of the Mother of God in the canons of the feast. The Proto-Evangelium of James provides a moral interpretation for the symbol of the dove to describe Mary's purity while she dwelt in the temple, an idea echoed also in the hymnography of the feasts. Moreover, there is a third interpretation in which Mary is paralleled with the dove that informed Noah after the flood had ended. The Mother of God is presented as a messenger, counterparting the messenger dove after the cataclysm, who signifies the end of the obscure law and preaches salvation and the beginning of a new era. I quote a hymn, "As a dove, the Theotokos noetically bears the sprig of the olive tree in her body, proclaiming beforehand in the house of God the peace and calm following the ancient flood that tyrannized all earth." We observe that the first and most important group of images sets the basic scene for the events of the entrance. The Mother of God, a living temple, enters the temple of the ancients as a pure sacrifice. But what happens inside? The second group of exegetical themes of the entrance is related to the procession of women in the temple. As the Proto-Evangelium of James describes, Mary was led to the temple by a group of virgins carrying lamps, after which the whole house of Israel followed her. The role of the leading virgins was to carry lamps in order to attract the attention of the child and keep her from turning back to her parents. The prominent position of the virgins prefigures the child's miraculous virginity, of course, but a group of lamp-carrying virgins also brings other connotations to the believer's mind. Even though not explicitly mentioned, the connection with the parable of the wise and foolish virgins in Matthew 25 is apparent. But Mary, as an ambassador for the whole humanity in its quest for reconciliation with God, gathers around her the support of all believers in different times. In this timeless spirit, the virgins call the choirs of believers to join them for the celebration of the entrance. The use of the rhetorical device of enargia, vivification, brings the choirs of virgins to the moment of the performance of the hymn, and their reasons, logi, are illuminated by the Logos' divine radiance. A hymn described this aptly. In anticipation of your coming, today the choirs of lamp bearers brightly prepare both visible lamps and noetic lamps of the logi, crying out, all works of the Lord, praise the Lord with hymns and exalt him unto all ages. However, it is not only the virgins in the temple of Jerusalem who await Christ, but also the believers who sing the hymn, who join the entrance procession, and thus the chanting of the hymn elevates the churchgoers to a timeless divine reality. I quote, celebrating the coming of the Theotokos into the sanctuary, let us too, carrying lamps today in spirit, go in joy with the virgins to the temple. From a typological point of view, the procession is most prominently seen as the fulfillment of the prefiguration presented in Psalm 44, a royal wedding hymn. Mary is God's bride, and thus her marriage with him must take place before her unfulfilled betrothal to Joseph. The entrance is indeed a wedding procession, even though Mary is just a child. But the real union, giving birth to Christ, is yet to come, and the entrance is an engagement contract testified by the Holy Spirit. I quote, the contract of thy betrothal, the divine tokens of your motherhood, past understanding, O pure virgin, are written today by the Holy Spirit in the house of God. Just as the iconography of the feast presents the Theotokos in adult vestments instead of childish clothes, so do the canons agree with this idea. The headscarf is not only a vestment of a married woman, but it also manifests her spiritual maturity that becomes apparent in her own decisiveness on the dedication to the temple. I quote, clearly seeing the 3-year-old treading and living in of her own will in the temple, the parents of the Virgin offered their voices in thanksgiving and ardent faith. Even though Mary is just a small child, she is also a bride, a fact attested to by the iconography of the entrance, as I said, where she is depicted with a headscarf, clothing of married women. And due to her childish innocence, she will dwell in the Holy of Holies as if in a wedding chamber. A canon of the forefeast described this procession into the temple as a mystical wedding procession, even though Mary is still an infant. Today, the temple receives you as a pure and truly beautiful bride, adorned with great glory, and introduces the symbols of your mystical marriage to God, arraying you in bridal finery, O only undefiled one. Indeed, as I said, the whole feast of the entrance seems to be located in a border zone between the Old and New Covenant. On one hand, as we saw, the Mother of God becomes a fulfillment of the earlier types and prefigurations, such as the temple and Psalm 44. On the other hand, all these earlier types, as well as the last group of prefigurations of the Annunciation and the Eucharist, that I will talk about later, are referring to the New Covenant. The hymnographic references to the old types and the shadows of law passing away during the entrance are abundant, and the procession in the Temple of Jerusalem is seen as the first public sign of the Incarnation. I quote, the written law has passed away and vanished as a shadow, and the rays of grace shone forth at your entry into the temple of God, O undefiled Virgin Mother, who art forever blessed. So earlier on, we heard about Mary being the spiritual and living temple and the fulfillment of the Temple of Jerusalem. However, in the text of the entrance, the temple is also dealt with from a mystical point of view. The early church father Origen presents Jerusalem's temple as a model of spiritual growth in contemplation. People standing outside of the temple, according to Origen, belong to the active ones that later fathers would call those living in praxis or vita practica, while those who enter the temple are those who conduct a life of contemplation. So in Mary's life, as observed through these Origenian lenses, I would say, there are two images of spiritual growth: the entrance into the temple, in other words, stepping from practical life to spiritual life, and the elevation of senses to divine visions, which is the culmination of the spiritual passage from physici theoria, as the fathers say, contemplation of nature, to theologia, contemplation of the divine. Before we approach the sensory experiences of the Virgin in the temple that I will talk about, we have to be aware that the status quo of this experience is that of stepping beyond the senses. In other words, a mystagogical movement. According to the Proto-Evangelium of James, Mary stepped into the Holy of Holies, already in the Jewish temple cult, a place of mystical encounter with the divinity. Later sources are even more explicit about this. The Georgian Life states that Mary was intelligent with respect to images and words, a scrutinizer of divine visions. Mysticism means etymologically both shutting and initiating. And therefore, after the public spectacle that the entrance provided to everyone present in the Temple of Jerusalem, the Theotokos is then shut away from the eyes of the public. There is an element of monastic enclosure here. Enclosure is an ascetical virtue that we see in the lives of desert fathers. Anthony the Great, for example, entered a tomb, an abandoned fortress, to fight with demons. In the life of the Theotokos, as attested to by the scriptures and other sources, we can find various aspects of enclosure, enklismos. In the secrecy of a restricted place of the Holy of Holies, hidden from the eyes of others, she goes through her personal spiritual struggles with dark powers and prepares for her future task. She preserves her physical purity and, most importantly, communes with God. All the miraculous events of the Theotokos happen in enclosure. According to the Proto-Evangelium of James, she was kept in a ritually closed space during the first years of her infancy in order to stop her from treading on the ground before entering the Temple of Jerusalem. When she was 3 years old, she was taken by her parents to the Temple of Jerusalem, where she dwelled until she was betrothed to Joseph. The Annunciation happened in a closed space, also according to Luke, who mentions that Gabriel came in unto her. Christ was born in the enclosure of a cave, according to the tradition of the Proto-Evangelium of James. And after Christ's resurrection, Mary dwelled in the upper room of Zion, living an ascetical life, as the Georgian Life of the Virgin suggests. And finally, she was buried in a tomb from which her body was transferred after her death. Most importantly, however, Mary was the ultimate embodiment of enclosure herself. Her womb remained closed despite her pregnancy and childbirth. So the spectacle of physical beauty fades away as the Theotokos draws herself into the secrecy of the Holy of Holies to live invisibly, at least to bodily eyes, since one can approach the vision of God only in invisibility, as Palamas notes. As is commonly known, the fulfillment of ησυχία for him is spiritual vision, theoria. To continue with the words of Palamas, through her noetic silence, noetis σιγή, Mary rises above all creation, and she beholds the glory of God even more than Moses did, and looks at the divine grace that is by no means subdued to the power of sensory perception, but is a delightful and sacred vision for spotless souls and minds. Palamas binds together her bodily beauty, depicted in Psalm 44, with the radiation of divine energies from her as through a mirror. Her parents and everyone else leave the temple, and she alone enters the world of invisibility, or in other words, theoria. According to Tarasius of Constantinople, while dwelling in the Holy of Holies, Mary constantly beheld the Holy Spirit and invisibly chased away the hosts of demons. This new spiritual sense of sight allowed her to see not only the divine economy of God, but also the deceit of the evil one. However, even in the invisibility of the Holy of Holies, she does not cease to be a spectacle, only her audience changes. According to the Georgian Life, the Virgin was a spiritual image, an eloquent expression, frightful to demons and the desire of angels. In the context of the Originian exegesis of the Temple of Jerusalem, we saw that the entrance in the temple is an image of the entrance into contemplative life, but the entrance into the Holy of Holies underlines this even more. In the Apostica of the Vespers of the feast, Anna exhorts her daughter, enter the place where none may enter and learn mysteries. And Germanos of Constantinople even claims, through the mouth of the high priest Zacharias, that Mary entered heavenly life, ascending from earth to the ethereal spheres through her entrance into the Holy of Holies. This also echoes the mystical and ecstatic visions which Enoch, according to apocryphal tradition, received in the Holy of Holies of the temple. And indeed, Mary beheld amazing divine visions in the sanctuary. Isidore of Thessalonica states that the high priest who entered the sanctuary once a year did not see God in the same way the Theotokos did. She, being closer to God, became worthy to behold higher visions. But one must understand that for a Byzantine Christian, this was not understood only as a historical event, but also experienced in every liturgical space. The altar of each church was and still is a Christian Holy of Holies, so to say, where the entrance of women was forbidden. And this fact was connected with the entrance of Mary into the Holy of Holies, as is evidenced by the dispute narrative of the Virgin Empress Pulcheria, attempting to enter the altar in order to receive communion, but stopped by the thereafter heretical patriarch Nestorius. According to the story, she, Pulcheria, argued for her entry into the sanctuary with the phrase, "Have I not given birth to God?" identifying herself with the Theotokos. Be this narrative historical or not, it shows at least a later Christianized reading of the entrance narrative, and that this event was imitated by women striving to live in virginity in imitation of Mary. Mary's life in the Holy of Holies was one of examining the creation of the world, as temple mysticism taught, but this was also the matter that continued in the Christian tradition through the sacrifice of Eucharist in the altar space. That moment of the descent of the Holy Spirit in order to transform the bread and wine into his body and blood brings together creation and the end of the world. This brings to our minds the passage of the Proto-Evangelium of James, where an angel was set to feed Mary in the Holy of Holies. This text, Proto-Evangelium I mean, does not specify what this nourishment was. While the Byzantine authors were not interested explicitly in the taste of this food, they were certainly intrigued to find out its essence. In the liturgical sources, there are numerous references to this food. In the hymns of the feast, this food is called heavenly nourishment, but also more explicitly bread or heavenly bread, Artos Uranios. The latter term naturally connects it to Christ, who is the heavenly bread. In a sermon on the entrance, Germanos of Constantinople calls this nourishment ambrosia and nectar. It is noteworthy that this is the only reference in any source that actually provides description of the actual taste of Mary's heavenly food, since in antiquity they were considered fragrant and delightful, I mean ambrosia and nectar. In the other spurious sermon attributed to Germanos, there is a reference that this nourishment was either material or spiritual. He doesn't specify it. George of Nicomedia, in his second sermon on the feast, discusses the substance of this nourishment at greater length. Through the mouth of Zacharias, he wonders why an immaterial angel brings food that is somehow material. And St. George asks, who has made it? What is the hand that has baked this bread? So several texts on the entrance seem to be interested in the essence of the bread, and at the same time seem unable to conclude if it was spiritual or material, or a combination of these two. We should perhaps not read these speculations as concrete suggestions for the origin of the food, but as a rhetorical idea for paradox, since the food is not merely angelic, but still seems to be somehow material. Georgios of Nicomedia's sermon concludes by wondering at the paradoxical origin of this bread, implying Holy Communion. Theophylactus of Ohrid explicitly draws this connection to the Eucharist. And we saw above that the idea of heavenly food was also paired with the idea of the Holy of Holies as the Christian altar. The timeless and eschatological aspects of the Holy of Holies also allowed the Theotokos to partake of the Eucharist, despite this happening before the Eucharist was instituted by Christ. And indeed, in the Byzantine understanding of the Eucharist, it is never a repetition of Christ's sacrifice, but one and the same sacrifice that Christ set. What is interesting is that even though the heavenly nourishment seems to be connected with the Eucharist, there is also a development inherent in its description. The Georgian life states that Mary's presence in the temple became more new and more wonderful, and her nourishment more wonderful, and the development of her mind greater, because her nourishment was from above, and it was given by the hand of an archangel. This, at least to me, seems to imply a spiritual growth that results in an increased capacity for receptiveness. The same idea is present in George's second sermon, where he describes how the nourishment added both spiritual and bodily beauty to the growing child, Mary. However, later on in his third sermon, he specifies that this nourishment was not in order to forgive her sins, since she was completely pure. Somehow this linkage between heavenly nourishment, Mary's growth in virtues, and God's word as the bread of life, as shown by Christ himself in Matthew's gospel, is elided in the life by Epiphanios, where he says that Mary was nurtured or maintained, etrepeto, by the temple. This happened through, I quote Epiphanios, perseverance in prayers, study, fasting, handiwork, and all virtues, so that the truly holy Mary would become the teacher of many women in regard to the multitude of work and spiritual life. As this passage, also elsewhere heavenly nourishment is naturally linked with fasting. Mary abstained from earthly food and avoided idonie, as the fathers say, but became worthy to partake of heavenly nourishment and enjoyed tryphi. In the case of food, this is perhaps more concrete than in the other ways of marriage, the other forms of marriage life in the temple. But Gregory Palamas expands this process also to include her other senses. He sees that the fact that Mary was able to taste and see the grace of God as a result of her abstinence from other sensory perception. For Gregory, the Holy of Holies as a place was also a type, in other words, a shadow of reality. The reality was the heavenly courtyard in which Mary already lived as a child. Therefore, her food must have been heavenly. What is of particular interest in the entrance is the way the process of Christ's incarnation is expressed. Mary's mystical life in the temple resulted in her hearing God. It is also through this particular sense of hearing, according to several preachers, that the conception of Christ happened. It is only proper that the word, logos, is conceived through word. In the gospel narrative of Luke, more exactly in the event of the Annunciation, Mary answers Gabriel's message, "Be it unto me according to thy word." Mary inclining her ears to God's message of incarnation, however, is expanded in the narratives regarding her time in the temple. Both the life written by Epiphanius and the Georgian life even describe a type of pre-annunciation in which Mary receives an explicit message regarding her role as the incarnate God's mother while still living in the temple. I quote the passage from the Georgian life in length. When she was nearing 12 years old, there was a precursor and foreshadowing of her annunciation. One day at midnight, she was standing right in front of the doors of the sanctuary and offering prayers and supplications to God with a merciful and holy heart. Then behold, an event great and tremendous to hear, a great light shone forth in the temple, so brilliant that in it the brightness of the visible sun became small and dark. And she heard a voice from the sanctuary that said, "Mary, from you my son will be born." It is noteworthy that in this vision there are two senses involved, those of sight and hearing. Byzantines understood hearing as a way of forming mental images that not only help us imitate the protagonist of the story, but also to personally participate in historical events. The collaboration of these two senses, however, has an also deeper theological background. The combination of a bright light and a voice reminds the reader of Christ's transfiguration on Mount Tabor, where the voice of the Father spoke to the disciples. The event of transfiguration is also echoed in the narrative of this pre-annunciation. Mary's reaction to the paradoxical message corresponds to Christ's exhortation to the disciples after the transfiguration to remain silent about what they saw until his rising from the dead. And it is for this that Epiphanios of Kallistratos notes, she remained silent and told no one about the mystery until Christ had ascended to heaven. Unsurprisingly, as the Transfiguration constituted a key event to the Hesychast movement, Gregory Palamas also draws the parallel between sight and remaining silent, again reflecting the Transfiguration, by noting that Mary's life in the temple was unseen by all, and accordingly, her life had to be unheard by all in silence. To put it otherwise, the sense of hearing is coupled with remaining silent. However, Mary does not listen attentively only to divine voices, and silence is not interpreted merely spiritually, but also practically. The sense of hearing, akoi, is here connected, as is the case etymologically in the Greek language, with the virtue of obedience, ipakoi. The notion of obedience and hearing is thus coupled with Mary's silence. For example, the Life by Epiphanios makes this comparison when it states that she was reticent and quick to listen, Olegolalos tachipikos. There are interesting passages in several sources that refer to Mary's listening to liturgical texts in the temple. While dwelling there, she heard sacred scriptures being read during the divine temple offices, especially during the Sabbath. This was a formation that was necessary for her to prepare herself to become the mother of the Logos, as noted by Gregory Palamas. In a way, the weight that is given to the entrance changes the way the process of incarnation is seen in the patristic tradition. It is as if the process of Mary's response to the question whether or not she shall agree to give birth to God was expanded. The traditions of the entrance show that by the time Gabriel appears to her at the Annunciation, Mary already knew that she would become the mother of God. She knew the scriptures, and according to the Georgian life of the Virgin, she had heard an explicit pre-annunciation in the temple. But why is she then hesitating to accept Gabriel's message during the Annunciation? The Middle Byzantine tradition claims even explicitly, for example, in a sermon by Andrew of Crete, that Christ had already been conceived in Mary's womb before Gabriel visited her. The dialogue of hesitance and acceptance between them is then actually a rhetorical debate of persuasion, where Mary wants to become certain that the one appearing to her is truly an angel of light and not an angel of darkness. But this is a matter that we shall not discuss here. If you're interested in it, I have published a paper quite recently about this topic. So to conclude, we have seen how rich the Feast of the Entrance is in its theological teaching, and yet we have not been able to cover most of the themes that appear in the hymns and homilies of this feast. And actually, this is true for many Byzantine feasts. We still lack comprehensive studies of many great feasts of the Church. We have a huge amount of unpublished hymns and sermons that still wait to be published and studied. Unfolding the tradition of the Church hidden in these sources will give us food for thought for decades, if not centuries, to come. Thank you very much for your attention.